30 feet of concrete with a classified design used to sniff out nuclear explosions.
It even had superconducting shielding. Its claim to fame was that nothing from the outside could affect it.
Not only could Ingo perfectly sketch the design, but the needle moved, and nearly got them kicked out of Stanford for breaking the experiment.
And that got the attention of the CIA.
I asked the CIA agents, why are you looking me up? He says, well, we couldn't care less about the fact that he perturbed that magnetometer, but the fact that he could look through superconducting shielding and see what was inside, that is really a concern.
In a way, I can understand other people's response to our work. If someone had come up and told me 4 years ago the kinds of things I'm now telling people, I think I would have been skeptical also.
Well, when I first met Ingo, of course, he was coming out with this claim of, quote, being a psychic. And at that time, before I started seeing results, I was very skeptical. And he was very confident.
The psychic is a kind of remote sensing device, and that I think has a contribution to make to both science and humanity.
To understand Ingo, I think you have to see a creative, highly intelligent, deeply wounded man who found in remote viewing a pathway to the acclaim that he sought.
We might do an experiment that looked like a really good outcome, and he would say, no, this is not so good, and he would come up with some loophole. And so he would say, look, if we take credit for an experiment and then someone can come along later and find some loophole or some false positive, then they'll reject it, and then even when we do good experiments, they'll reject it.
He told me a story. He was a homosexual, which doesn't matter, I mean, who cares, but it mattered to him because he told me a story which I've never forgotten of being beaten up by a bunch of boys who he liked and admired when he was a youth. And I think he wanted to be acknowledged.
I've often recovered many of the thoughts about existence I had as a child. A major one of these was the separation of consciousness from the body, which was very real when I was a child. This kind of thing happens in art. I believe, and always have believed, and I've returned to it many times in my life, that I am not this body in terms of consciousness, and consciousness can go places where the body cannot.
It was very important to him to be validated by SRI. SRI was the first lab of a different order of magnitude from all prior parapsychological research.
What SRI was always upset about is that during our day here, we brought in 1% of the money and 99% of the publicity.
Back in 1972, SRI was primarily a contractor for the government and some industry. With the riots in the late 60s, early 70s, the fact that classified work was going on at Stanford University, they didn't like that.
Up until that time, most parapsychological research was done by small foundations on minuscule budgets operating in a corner of some basement.
At SRI, the level of classification was top secret. It took a long time to get the security clearance.
You can't walk around, you have to be escorted because of the secret projects. Full of high-class scientific equipment, beeping and showing on the cathode ray tubes and all that.
And when Russell and Hal got positioned there, it had a big impact. And on Ingo, it had a particularly big impact because the work that he did at SRI drew a lot of attention.
To be in that kind of laboratory, they must be very important and really have a grasp of the truth. So you guys had a psychological procedure, the in the neighborhood thing, as it were, that was fantastic, and I think that's partially why you got such damn good results.
And all of them succeeded in remote viewing. Drs. Puthoff and Targ do not know how. And so maybe one of the most important things about the work done here is that it has been published in one of the most conservative and prestigious scientific journals in the world, with this note: few readers will finish without wondering for at least a moment if indeed ESP might be possible after all. What a difference that would make to us all. Jack Perkins, NBC News, Stanford Research Institute, California.
Ingo was really the father of remote viewing in the modern era. Before Ingo, people were describing the picture in the envelope.
Square.
Good guess, but wrong.
He said, if I want to see what's in the envelope, I'll open the envelope. I can focus my attention anywhere on the planet, give me something interesting to look at.
And he threatened to quit. And so we asked him, well, you know, what do you mean? What would you like to do? And he says, just send somebody out in the San Francisco Bay Area and I'll describe where they are.
Well, it takes a lot of guts to accept a challenge like this. The psychics involved could sort of get into it at a creative level and discover things very distant from themselves and then go find out if they were really there.
Well, we had, by now, 30 analysts, not scientists, in CIA, and maybe 6 or 7 scientists in CIA talking about these initial dozen or so results of these anecdotal situations.
We began by speaking of some kind of almost a psychic arms race here. Is there any real application to this?
At that time, there were rumors, certainly, that the government was doing something, but nobody actually knew what was going on.
Why are the intelligence communities chasing after this thing called remote viewing? What if there are no secrets? What's really going on here?
They had to put resources on something that sounded crazy. That's what it was. And we would all talk about them and say, well, I know I didn't lie. I know you didn't lie. And we'd get polygraphed once in a while, and it became clear we weren't lying. That wasn't the issue. What's going on?
These people from CIA were very concerned. They had one goal in mind, to prove that it was nonsense. Well, we've looked into your background. You've had these high security clearances. You've been polygraphed. We know we can trust you. The Russians have been spending millions of dollars over a decade at some of their best institutes investigating so-called ESP. No scientists in America even believe there's such a thing as ESP. In fact, it was because the Soviets had a completely materialistic viewpoint. Even in Lenin's writings, he said, since consciousness isn't observable, it must be physical, and therefore physical things must have consciousness. And so he thought even atoms had some level of consciousness.
And then the question becomes, how close does it have to be for you to see it? Can you see it in this room and the next? How about, can you see it on the other side of town? The question began to start formulate about distance.
Maybe, like everything else that we know physically, it's quantum mechanical. That means it's spread out everywhere. It's not in space-time anymore. So that's exactly the same way that I can focus on my name being spoke. There's something about attention that I can use in order to narrow in and pay attention to something. So if I want to pay attention to what's happening on Pluto a million years ago, I should be able to do that. That's kind of what the remote viewers do. I mean, Ingo Swann was looking at Jupiter 9 months before Voyager got there and correctly described rings that no astronomer had ever seen or even suspected. So how did he do that? Well, it suggests that the rings of Jupiter was in his head already. This becomes a very materialistic way of thinking about what's going on, but who cares? I mean, I'm interested in what the truth is.
We don't know how to evaluate this. We don't know if it's a threat or what.
Well, I would say the difference between the American scientific community and the Soviet is that at the highest levels in the Soviet scientific community, psychic research is taken seriously, and there's no doubt about it.
And you claim in this country it is not?
I would say in this country it's not, because people are worried about the so-called giggle potential.
Our normal socialization, being a psychologist now, is that stuff like ESP is nonsense, it can't happen. So if somebody tells you to do it, they're asking something stupid.
And they banged a telephone book size thing down on the table. Paraphysics R&D, Warsaw Pact, from the Defense Intelligence Agency. When I thumbed through that and saw all the work that was going on.
So the CIA was tracking all of these people.
Yeah, in this case it was DIA.
Here is the report that I finally wrote that summarized everything we could find at that time. And it was called Key Intelligence Question number 9. I labeled it paraphysics because I had to find a word that allowed us at the Foreign Technology Division to sense that there is a legitimate physics connection here.
So let's just randomly, like a government support for parapsychics research.
Paraphysics.
Paraphysics. Returning with stories of official government support for such research. In fact, such support seems unquestioned by anyone. All of the Soviet centers, of course, are government funded. 1971.
That's right. So especially over there, since everything was government funded, you had to take it more seriously.
In principle, this document forms more policy than anything else that goes on in the intelligence community. Why should the intelligence community be interested in it? Access information, in a generic sense. You can use it for communications, like to remote places, submarines, and that came up later. I thought they'd laugh me out of the room.
So what was their reaction when you
Positive.
said that? It was
positive.
You got a positive reaction?
Yes. They said, hey, this is good stuff, follow it.
When he wrote his first report, Dale Graff had no idea what he was getting defense intelligence into. Despite a series of remote viewing experiments that beat the odds at over 1 million to 1, the CIA was still skeptical.
The Army, CIA, DIA, they all had remote viewing programs eventually, but it all began with the NSA break-in.
The real operational work began not with the bang of bullets and bombs, but with a whisper.
I'm sorry, actually I misdirected you. You were on the right... No, we should be up there.
About 2 psychics and 2 laser physicists that broke into the most secret NSA site that ever existed. It was a whisper that would eventually be heard around the world. The CIA had a new secret weapon.
There was a hiatus, and then Sugar Grove came along. And somebody says this cockamamie thing, well, now what we're doing is we're doing remote viewing by coordinates. And I say, what?
It was codenamed Scan8.
The Scan8 program was started by Ingo Swann, and in that program, where we were using coordinate remote viewing, a viewer described what was located at any geographical coordinate of latitude and longitude, and would then describe what's there.
And they tell me what this is. And I say something like, well, you're going to have to prove that to me. And the door opened at the end of the hallway, and a guy walks out. Could you give me some coordinates, just map coordinates of a place that you know? He says, this'll do it. He says, I'm positive you don't know anything about what's there. I said, perfect. I took him.
And then Kit gave Hal those coordinates that nobody knew about.
From Ingo's standpoint, he said this is really a sexy target. It's got all kinds of antennas. Seems like a very hush-hush place, very military, and he drew how things were laid out.
The results came back so specific on paper that I was just like, I was kind of nonplussed. It included a diagram, guardhouse, accordion doors that roll up big enough to put a Jeep through, 4 stories below, hallway, cipher lock, and I took it to my colleague Dave, who would give me the coordinates, and I said, here. He said, man, Green, this is nonsense. I said, are you really sure? And he said, man, I gave you the coordinates of the log cabin I just built in West Virginia. So I called up my colleagues and I gave them the results, and I'm sick of it. And just before I hung up, the fellow I was talking to, who I can't name, but whose initials were Russ Targ, said, "That's really too bad. It's really too bad. Really too bad." The other guy found the same thing.
Early in the SRI program, there had been some publicity, and Pat Price had read about it. That happened to be right when we had been asked to target on the West Virginia site. So it was over the telephone, saying, you know, I used to be maybe police commissioner or something like that in Burbank, and sometimes I would get intuitive flashes about some crime scene that we were working on, and it would turn out I would be right. Maybe I should be a subject.
SRI comes up with Pat Price. He had a map on the over his desk, and he had a bunch of pins on the map of the world, and their pins were all stuck in the ocean. And I asked him, I said, "Pat, what are all those pins? They're just scattered all around." He said, "Oh, I'm following all the nuclear submarines in the world, and I move the pins around and I relocate them." For an intelligence officer, I mean, this would be one of the most fundamental breakthroughs in naval intelligence if you could follow all the submarines in the world.
Pat Price was brought in independently to describe the same target location and went on to read documents hidden in the vault 3 floors below the surface.
I said, "That's really interesting." Okay, yeah, okay, I'll talk. What did you say? And I drove to the coordinates, and I found the cabin. 100 meters down the road, I found a dirt road from the cabin. I drove down it, found the guardhouse, found the dish, found the accordion door.
This naval installation's purpose is to perform communications research and development for the U.S. Navy, the Department of Defense, and various elements of the U.S. government.
I reported that.
It got to the Office of Research and Development, it got to the Office of OTS, and there was, a huge controversy.
And it started as very small ball.
But what the person who picked the target didn't realize was just right over the ridge, a mile or so away, whatever it was this super secret facility for picking up Russian satellite information as it went overhead. And so both of them said, maybe that's what they want us to describe.
In the 1960s, Sugar Grove became one of the NSA's most important Cold War listening facilities. And then the whole thing blew up.
But remember, it was about what was inside that building. File folders with the following names. I remember that they were all associated with a pool game, like playing pool or billiards.
Filing cabinet on the north wall labeled Operation Pool Cue. 4-ball, 8-ball, rack up.
I'm saying, this is reminiscent of his visit to the place that Kit took him.
Within 48 hours, I had security officers in my office at headquarters. And they were grim-faced and they were upset. And I was told this officially, it's been made public. The filing cabinets were there, they were green, there were file folders, and they had the exact 3 names on the file folders. Now, that was the first thing that was important, is that they were correct. However, those guys out in California got the code names. They got code names that were part of a special access program, not just code names. They got special access program code names which